Hello, everybody. Welcome to you. Hi, Dolores. Welcome, Steve. Hi, Kay. Thank you for coming. Please do share. So, yesterday, I started working on foreign policy. I covered the extreme corruption in this administration involving appointments of people from a single company, all kinds of people from a single company in high positions in various critical foreign policy positions, all related to one another. Joe Biden's foreign policy team basically coming from a single company. Truly a revelation. All this happening in the context of the challenge, of China. I then went into some depth of detail the foreign policy of the United States towards Cuba. Not just the foreign policy now, but the foreign policy over the years, for 60 years, towards Cuba. So tonight I'm going to continue with the examination of foreign policy that I began then. Where we're going to go now is to Peru, and we'll cover what's been happening there. And then once we're done with that, we'll cover what a few senators are trying to do, something very important in relation to changing our foreign policy. Then we'll cover some Julian Assange, which also relates to foreign policy. Then we'll cover a more general view on what the foreign policy of the United States seems to have been. And then we will end up with why that foreign policy is not in the national interest of the United States, which is a classical category for the evaluation of foreign policy, of course. But I'm going to shift that category a little, and I'm going to start talking about the public purpose of the United States. And I'm going to want to show why our foreign policy is so opposed to the public purpose of the United States. There's Go Start, says, here's Joe. Well, thank you. Hi, all. Hi, Go Start. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. Let me share the screen with the first of the pieces, specifically Cruella Moments in Peru, it's called. I picked this up from LA Progressive. Usually, generally, their articles appear somewhere else. And this one came from from a guy by the name of Oliver Boyd Barrett. And it doesn't look like it appeared anywhere else before. Looks like it might be original to LA Progressive. It's a pretty detailed piece and a pretty good one. Cruella Moments in Peru. There's Cruella herself, Keiko Fujimori. The only character who actually dies in Disney's Cruella is the sweet, good servant, Catherine, who consents to raise Cruella, condemned to death by her birth mother, the grotesquely unfeeling Baroness de Ville, as her own daughter. So Cruella and the Baroness shall dance a burlesque that plays out to the morbid rhythm of an eternal melody. Similarly, in Peru, since even the time of Spanish dominion, a macabre masquerade has been enacted between conservatives and liberals, parties born of the same mother, empire, whose local nemesis, Pachamama, struggles vaguely with these uninvited adoptees in the face of their mutual despoliation of the natural order. Pachamama and her birth children, the indigenous, do not fare well in this movie. But Peru, and perhaps the world's greatest living and truly genius novelist, 2010 winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, specifically Mario Vargas Llosa, and unequaled expert on the psychology of Latin American caudillos, is himself the progeny of Peru's deepest contradictions in any other context. It would be difficult to conceive how the celebrator of anarchy in La Guerra del Fin del Mundo could possibly condemn Pedro Castillo, whom progressives must continue to hope will be inaugurated as president of Peru on July 28th, as a presage of dictatorship and backwardness. To deepen his wound, Vargas Llosa, who campaigned for the presidency in 1990 against Alberto Fujimori, has expressed his preference for Cruella herself, Keiko Fujimori, Alberto's eldest daughter. Her father dissolved the Peruvian Congress in 1992, setting him up as dictator for the next 8 years, and whose enforcer was intelligence chief Vladimiro Montesinos, with the help of $10 million from the CIA, with whom Mr. Montesinos had a long-standing relationship. CIA financed an anti-narcotics unit organized by Montesinos in the National Intelligence Service, SIN, it's called, SIN, despite reports of the involvement by Fujimori's eminence grise in corruption, drug trafficking, and human rights violations. A powerful Peruvian drug lord of the 1990s, Demetrio Chavez, testified in court that he paid US dollars $50,000 monthly in bribes to Montesinos and several army officers. Age 19 in 1994, Keiko, who appears to have specialized more than anything else in the fine art of losing 3 presidential elections, accepted the First Lady title of First Lady from her father. Alberto had booted out and had accused him both publicly and in court of kidnapping, torture, and corruption, and sought to run against him in the 1995 elections. Alberto changed the law so that Susana could not qualify. Comparable perhaps to the bestowal on Keiko of the title of First Lady, Vargas Llosa, who replaced his own wife for 50 years in 2016 in favor of the 64-year-old mother of Enrique Iglesias, dubbed the Pearl of Manila by the Daily Mail, was willing recipient of the hereditary title of first monarchy in the peerage of Spain, granted him in 2011 by the King of Spain, Juan Carlos I, the monarch who was soon to abdicate in disgrace for financial and other improprieties. In this novel, La Tumba on los Andes, 1993, Vargas Llosa turned his attention to the Andean indigenous at the peak of the Maoist-inspired rural terrorist movement, Sendero Luminoso. He peered deep into a primeval blackness belied by the peasantry's colorful alpaca hats, face masks, and ponchos. His niece, the film director Claudia Llosa, achieves much the same effect in her anthropological dissection of Andean village culture in is that Made in USA in 2006, and La Teta Asustada, 2009. In his more recent Tiempos Recios, Vargas Llosa constructs an allegory of the Fujimori and Montesino years, a sort of lament, perhaps for his own failure to outbeat Fujimori in 1990 in the election, and in which politically naive, fearful members of Lima's wealthy technocracy are represented as vain and foolish. Nor should we forget that in his novel El Sueño del Celta, 2010, Vargas Llosa had already painted as horrific a picture of the abuse and slaughter of Amazonian indigenous by the European rubber interests around at the turn of the 20th century as has ever been accomplished. Which leads us then to wonder at Vargas Llosa's monumental failure of political judgment when confronted with a choice between Keiko Fujimori and Pedro Castillo. For it is not the indigenous to whom we should look first for evidence of primeval blackness, but to the conquistadores, their armies, priests, and traders, whose swirling, mendacious blackness of racism, violence, and greed, conjoined with equally toxic liquids from the north, saturates beyond repair the entire continent of Latin America to this day. Vargas Llosa projects his attention outwards when he should be looking inwards. He has reversed cause and effect. He has reversed abuser and victim. It is not the indigenous who are dark and mysterious. More likely they are tired and they are angry. They are tired of providing pretty pictures for frivolous tourists whose travel to Peru from countries far wealthier than theirs contributes to planetary destruction, and whose corporations seize 70% of the profits earned by exploitation of the country's mineral resources on indigenous land. Peru has the world's biggest reserves of silver, as well as Latin America's largest gold reserves, lead reserves, and zinc. The Peruvian coast is renowned for its marine resources. The Amazon basin possesses large reserves of oil and gas, as well as abundant forestry resources. Winning the 2021 presidential election, Pedro Castillo explained, quote, Peru is such a wealthy country, but so much of the wealth, such as copper, gold, and silver, goes to foreigners. At the ports, you see an endless stream of trucks taking away the resources of the country, And just 200 meters away, you see a barefoot child, a child with tuberculosis, a child full of parasites. That is why we must renegotiate the contracts with big companies so that more of the profits remain in Peru and benefit the people. We must re-examine the free trade agreements we have signed with other countries so that we can promote local businesses. But what are the prospects of real change? In what follows, I should look at how Peru's natural wealth and indigenous people interact with Cruella's Hispanic Dance of the Macabre, starting with its latest episode, Pedro versus Keiko, then retreating to the Spanish conquest before moving to the mid-19th century reinterpretations of Cruella's dance that sought to integrate the indigenous on more harmonious grounds, and finally pausing at Peru's nearest shot at authentic revolution, the Velasco regime, and its morbid neoliberal Fujimori aftermath. The next section is about the policies and politics of Pedro Castillo. Castillo won the 2021 presidential election by a margin of 44,000 votes on the second round, with 50.1.4% of the votes counted as against, but Keiko Fujimori, who garnered 49.86% if the election is validated. Since then, of course, it has been validated, as we'll see in the next piece. Then President Castillo will command 42 out of 130 seats in Congress, while Fujimori's, Fuerza Popular, and the other right-wing electoral coalitions will have a combined parliamentary strength of at least 80 seats. If the election is not validated and no president is inaugurated on July 28th, and under the Constitution, there must be new elections. The 2021 presidential election in Peru should have ended several weeks ago at the time of this writing, but the validation of Castillo as president has been delayed by Fujimori's denunciations sin evidencia, without evidence, and in the style of Trump, yet afforded some legitimacy by representations of some military and conservative figures through their own media. More than 70% of Peru's news is owned and controlled by El Comercio Group, which, among other things, propagates Fujimori's ridiculous assertion that Castillo is a Sendero Luminoso communist. This might seem less outrageous in the capital, Lima, where Fujimori support is concentrated and where major corporations have threatened their employees with the loss of their jobs if they fail to vote for Fujimori. A highly suspicious massacre of 16 people in San Miguel del Ene on May 23rd, attributed by police to an unlikely, mysteriously reborn Sendero movement, was more likely to have been a ghastly pro-Fujimori terror campaign. Those who supported Keiko Fujimori's claim that the election had been stolen, that 200,000 votes should be thrown out, were concentrated in the upper classes of the capital, Lima, and included former military leaders and members of influential families. Some openly called for a new election or even a military coup if Mr. Castillo was sworn in. Hundreds of retired military officers sent a letter to top chiefs urging them to not recognize, quote, an illegitimate president, unquote. A former Supreme Court justice filed a lawsuit requesting that the entire election be annulled. The Defense Ministry has confirmed that Alberto Fujimori's henchman, Vladimiro Montesinos, in jail on a naval facility, was somehow able to use a landline number to make 17 phone calls to Pedro Rejas, a retired military officer and former loyal Fujimori cohort, who later revealed the recordings. In one conversation, Montesinos appeared to suggest that bribes be paid to an intermediary to 3 of the 4 members of an electoral tribunal to favor Fujimori in a recount. On July 3rd, Peru's government rejected Fujimori's request to seek an international audit of its June 6th election. Even the State Department had described the election as a model of democracy. International observers, including the Organization of American States, the OES, found no evidence of major irregularities. Both the USA and EU praised the electoral process, and Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, urged Peruvians to accept the election results. The National Elections Jury, charged with reviewing contested ballots, should have completed its task, but by mid-July it has, so that a new president can be sworn in on July 28th. Its work was held up by a week after one of the judges resigned. He has been replaced. A writer for the Financial Times has described Pedro Castillo, 51 years old, as a rural primary school teacher, the son of peasant farmers, and a trade union activist. Castillo recently elaborated, "This year we are celebrating the bicentennial of Peru as a republic, yet after 200 years, we still have a high level of illiteracy, and the homes of my parents and neighbors don't have electricity, lights, or running water. There's a totally abandoned health center where once in a while a nurse comes by, and maybe you can find a bandage or a few pills for all families." As I traveled in rural areas across the country, I found conditions similar to my hometown. Further into the Amazon, conditions are even worse. People there have nothing. They are totally abandoned by the state. Sound familiar? That's what's been happening in the United States. From 2005 to 2017, Castillo was affiliated with Peru, Posible, a centrist party led by former President Alejandro Toledo. In 2017, the year he attained prominence as a leading figure in the 2017 teacher strike in Peru, Castillo joined his current party, Partido Nacional Peru Libre, PNPL, or Peru Libre. It claims a Marxist-Leninist heritage and proposes a left-wing program centered around increased spending on education and health services, also nationalization of key extractive sectors, anti-corruption, and salary limits for congressional members. Castillo was born to two illiterate peasants in one of the poorest regions in Peru. He is the third child of 9 in his parents' family. 60% of people in Peru do not have access to the internet, and Castillo did not have a Twitter account. His campaign relied on community radios, personal visits to small towns, and cultural events. He built his presidential election campaign around resource nationalism and indigenous rights. A central tenet of his Peru Libre party is to restructure Peru as a plurinational state along the basic lines of Ecuador and Bolivia. But Peru has 4 major indigenous languages in the Andes, Quechua, Aymara, Cauqui, and Jacaru, and 43 more in the Amazon region. Wow. Castillo has plans to rewrite the Constitution, to give the state a greater role in the economy, and keep a larger share of profits from mineral resources. Amid uncertainty over the final electoral outcome, he appointed more moderate economic advisors and sought to retain central bank head Julio Velarde, seen by many as a symbol of stability. The Peru Libre program addresses land reform, nationalization of natural resources to ensure that most of this wealth remains in Peru and available for the eradication of poverty. Increases in state expenditure on social services, health and education, income redistribution, the decriminalization of abortion. Other targets include human trafficking, especially of women, the elimination of patriarchy and machismo in state and society, respect and promotion of women's reproductive rights, and the promotion of the self-organization of women at every level. Castillo himself, it should be noted, has reportedly opposed the legalization of abortion, same-sex marriage, and policies promoting gender equality. Additionally, Peru Libre aims to abandon the OES, the unofficial regime change machine, and return to UNASUR. The party strongly supports Cuba and Venezuela. Although Castillo won only 18% of the vote for Peru Libre in the first round, this was still something of a surprise since the main contender for the left was thought to have been Veronica Mendoza, candidates of the Juntos por el Peru coalition, who obtained slightly less than 8%. Castillo was one of the least known among 18 contenders in the field. 70% of voters did not choose either Pedro Castillo or Keiko Fujimori. Many voters had been convinced by opposition propaganda that Vladimir Cerrón, the Marxist leader of Castillo's party, Peru Libre, was the real power behind Castillo. It did not help that party, although constituted in part by school union organizers like Castillo, also maintains loose ties to Move a Deaf, a political movement that seeks amnesty for convicted terrorists and advocates political participation and reconciliation between fully rehabilitated former terrorists and the citizenry at large. Castillo is anything but a terrorist. On the contrary, he was a rendero who helped lead peasant civilian militias that were officially recognized by the Peruvian government to defend small towns in the Andes against Sendero Luminoso terrorist cells during the 1980s and early 1990s. But no matter how progressive Castillo's policies may seem, they're also worryingly flexible in the face of potential setbacks in different audiences. And in Peru, there is a bad history of the better promises of the progressives or of elements that are progressive, of neoliberals heading south. Think Alan Garcia, or Alanta Humala, as quickly as champagne bottles at campaign victory fiestas. The show of humble, even indigenous origins offers insufficient protect against such a return of events. Here are the politics and policies of Keiko Fujimori. Fujimori is clearly a member of the Peruvian elite, although one whose father is still doing jail time, as is his former intelligence chief. The two are estimated to have stolen a combined $600 million during their decade in power. In a pre-Trumpian and therefore more rational world, she would have stood nowhere near a position of power, since prudence dictates even to social elites they should keep the progeny of corrupt and murderous dictators hidden in the nursery or cellar, figuratively speaking, of course. In opinion polls, Fujimori has been among the least popular politicians in Peru. She has candidly supported her father's dictatorial legacy and defended his record of state-sponsored extrajudicial killings. She's been hailed by the New York Times as a, quote, towering symbol of the Peruvian elite and the heir to a right-wing populist movement started 3 decades ago by her father, the former president Alberto Fujimori, unquote. She became First Lady at the age of 19. She attended Stony Brook University in New York and earned a business degree from Boston University in 1997. She obtained her MBA from Columbia University in 2008. Her party, Fuerza Popular, promotes Fujimorism, advocating for free trade and strong security. 2016, Keiko Fujimori campaigned for tax breaks, incentives for small businesses to encourage the registration of informal companies and allowing indigenous communities to become shareholders in mining projects. She vowed to expand electricity and internet coverage into rural areas in 2021. She has advocated for state participation in strategic industries such as energy. She has also insisted that large mining projects must have the support of local communities to proceed. In short, she has cleverly hybridized the neoliberal policies of social elites with reassuring noises of concern for the middle class and the indigenous peoples. And this is I think, a very deep article into Peru and the coalitions there, okay, by Oliver Boyd Barrett. And I think that's a pretty good introduction to the piece that I'm going to cover now. But what you have to keep in mind about this is a perfect setup for the usual regime change attempts by the United States. It presents a situation similar to Venezuela, similar to Cuba. Okay, in many ways, it's really the election of Castillo waves the red flag in front of the face of the bull. The bull being us, the United States. And now we shift to a piece from Common Dreams. Okay, you just got from background. Now another act in the play. Unexpectedly, at least I wasn't quite expecting this. Unexpectedly, what happened to hang on a second. Oh, here it is. I did have the right page. I was just looking at articles on the bottom. Anyway, you're looking at it. Quote, change is coming. Leftist Pedro Castillo confirmed president-elect in Peru on July 20th, 2021 by Kenny Stansel in Common Dreams. So officials on Monday night declared socialist candidate Pedro Castillo the winner of last month's election in Peru following weeks of delays caused by far-right candidate Keiko Fujimori's baseless allegations of electoral fraud. Castillo, the son of illiterate peasant farmers, as you've heard, and defeated Fujimori, the daughter of jail former Peruvian dictator Alberto Fujimori, by a margin of 44,000 votes. Fujimori accused Castillo's supporters of tampering with tally sheets across the country, but in the weeks that followed the vote, no one came forward to corroborate her central claims that the identities of hundreds of poll workers had been stolen and their signatures falsified, quote unquote. In, quote, an action that would have disenfranchised many poor and indigenous Peruvians, unquote. She said, quote, to have about 200,000 votes tossed out in areas where Castillo won by a landslide, the Times noted. Okay, the New York Times, it says. On Monday, the country's National Electoral Court dismissed Fujimori's request to invalidate ballots from impoverished rural areas. The court's rejection of Fujimori's effort to overturn the will of Peruvian voters solidified her third straight defeat at the polls. David Adler tweeted, only the sustained mobilization of progressive forces in Peru and around the world could defeat Keiko Fujimori's coup attempt, but your solidarity will be critical to stave off what comes next. Attacks, threats, and a global effort, undoubtedly orchestrated by the United States, to undermine Castillo's redistributive agenda. And Progressive International had tweeted, it's official, Pedro Castillo will be sworn in as president of Peru on the 28th of July 2021, the bicentennial celebration of the country's independence from the Spanish Empire. And there's there is the announcement, which I cannot read and translate into Spanish. So, with his supporters, hundreds of whom spent weeks camped out in front of the Electoral Tribunal in Lima while votes were being counted, chanting, "Yes, we could," Castillo delivered a victory speech from a balcony in the nation's capital. Always the speeches from the balcony. I call for the broadest unity of the Peruvian people, said Castillo, a former rural educator and union leader who helped organize a nationwide teacher strike in 2017. Together, we'll share this struggle and this effort to make more just, dignified, and united Peru, addressing Fujimori. The president-elect added, let's not add more obstacles to moving this country forward. Shortly before election authorities made their official announcement, Fujimori said in a televised speech Monday evening that she would acknowledge the results out of respect for the law, but called his pending proclamation as president-elect illegitimate and insisted again that his party had stolen thousands of votes from her. Last month, Castillo emphasized votes from the highest mountain and farthest corner of the country are worth the same as votes from San Isidro and Miraflores, referring to affluent districts in Lima, the nation's capital city. No more making fun of workers, peasant leaders, or teachers, Castillo told the crowd of supporters, quote, today, you must teach the youth, the children, that we are all equal before the law, unquote. During a celebration on Monday night, Danny Castillo, a supporter of the president-elect, told reporters from DW News that, quote, change is coming, unquote. And there is Castillo right now, and presumably that is his wife. Castillo's campaign slogan, no more poor people in a rich country, resonated with millions of the Peruvians who say they voted for the former hotel cleaner and school teacher because he promised to reform the Constitution and hike taxes on mining firms' profits. Peru is the second largest copper-producing nation after Chile, and Castillo has vowed to reinvest revenue to improve social services, including health and education. Supporters of Castillo hope that an agenda of downward by redistribution and public provision can mitigate the worsening inequality they attribute to the neoliberal economic model implemented by ex-President Alberto Fujimori. The consequences of austerity and other corporate-friendly policies have become impossible to ignore in Peru and around the world during the coronavirus pandemic. But Peru has the world's highest documented per capita COVID-19 death toll, and nearly 10% of its population has been driven into poverty in the past year, according to the Times. Castillo's 5-year term begins on July 28th, 200th anniversary of Peru's triumph over Spanish colonialism. And, quote, let's end this bicentennial, which has had a lot of problems along the way, and open the door so the next bicentennial is full of hope for the future and a vision for a country in which we all enjoy and eat from the bread of the country, unquote, he said to a crowd of supporters last month. Quote, let's take back Peru for Peruvians, unquote. And that was basically the appeal of his campaign. So he won. It looks like he will be installed as president in 7 days if there are no further coup attempts in those 7 days. But after he is installed, you can count on hostile efforts and probably coup attempts, which will most probably involve the United States and the CIA, to try to displace him. That's just what our foreign policy has been like. Let us take a brief look at a map of South America. Just a little open map here. Let's hopefully we can use that. So we have in the north Venezuela, and we know the U.S. has been constantly trying to overturn the government. Okay, Venezuela. Then we have also Colombia, where a regime, a brutal regime, supported by the U.S., continues to exist. Then we have the government, okay, of Ecuador, where there was a surprise victory of right-wingers in a recent election, okay, in Ecuador, where the candidate of the left was defeated. So we have Colombia, okay, and Ecuador, still in the pro-U.S. camp, still governed by right-wingers who are neoliberals and who oppress indigenous peoples in both the countries. And then Peru, a very large and rich country on that side, okay, of South America. I apologize. I should be sharing this map, okay, with you, which I will now do. Okay. So here we are, Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, right? Here's Brazil, okay, which is under Bolsonaro. Okay. However, a struggle is going on for control, okay, of that country. Right now, it looks pretty good for Lula da Silva to come back as the president, okay, of that country. Okay. Now with Peru, okay, and the election there, we see a pink tide once again rising. That's if Castillo can hold on to Peru. Okay. In Bolivia, we see a recent victory of the MAS party there, of the Movement for Socialism. And so the pink tide is rising also there, okay, in Bolivia. And now we move south to Chile, okay, along the coast. Recently, the right wing has lost power there. People are in the process of preparing a new constitution. The possibility looks like it's very good for a socialist to be the next leader of Chile. So we will have the pink tide rising in Chile, in Bolivia, Peru, Brazil, okay, and also Venezuela. and most probably very active attempts by the United States to overturn new socialist or quasi-socialist uh, regimes in all of those countries, because all of them will be rejecting the imperialism of the United States. That is what is about to happen. The big question is, how are we going to respond? Also, by the way, the regime in Argentina is somewhat more lefty than usual these days. It doesn't seem like the United States is trying to overthrow the left there, because I think the left has made a sufficient number of compromises with the neoliberal interests that for the time being there doesn't seem to be any heavy CIA activities in Argentina. But we can probably look for those in Chile, in Bolivia, in Peru, in Brazil, to stop it from turning back to Lula, and continuing on inside Venezuela. Also have to point out, though the right-wing regime in Colombia is still in control, and is brutal, there's no telling what can happen in Colombia. It looks to me like the regime there is beginning to weaken. And so we don't know what will happen there. But it's worth taking a look at the map of South America and pointing out how many countries the CIA will have to be very active in to turn away the pink tide from South America once again. Also, the victory in Ecuador, while it was an unexpected victory, somewhat unexpected victory, may not hold water. The left is still very strong, in Ecuador. And whether the regime there can gain control with countries surrounding it, turning to the left, is going to be problematic. And the same applies to Colombia, too. We have to wait and see what happens. It's going to be a big question how the United States is going to respond. Some of these nations will be turning to China, undoubtedly, for financial support. So I'm afraid that I see a pink moon rising in Latin America. We will see how the United States actually responds. And the next piece is very relevant to this, because while that is going on, there are attempts that are being made here to modify the policies of the United States. So what you're looking at now is, this is a piece from Common Dreams, and there's a photo of a soldier, a U.S. Marine deployed in Al Buhardon, Iraq, in March 2006. Senators introduce legislation to curb endless U.S. wars, lethal arms sales. This is by Andrea Germanis of Common Dreams on July 20th, 2021. A trio of senators on Tuesday introduced legislation that would beef up congressional authority and national security with provisions to narrow presidential power to launch hostilities, make it easier to block certain weapon sales, and sunset authorizations of the use of military force including the 2001 AUMF that paved the way for the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. The founders envisioned a balance of power between the executive and legislative branches of government on national security matters. But over time, Congress has acquiesced to the growing, often unchecked power of the executive to determine the outline of America's footprint in the world, said Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut. Who introduced the National Securities Powers Act. There's a PDF there containing the act, along with Senators Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, and Mike Lee, Republican of Utah. Yes, the sponsors are bipartisan. Evidently, when it comes to international affairs, Mike Lee is not such a monster as many of the other Republicans and Democrats. More than ever before, he continued, this is Chris Murphy continuing. More than ever before, he continued, quote, presidents are sending men and women into battle without public debate and making major policy decisions like massive arms sales without congressional input. On the issue of war powers, the proposed legislation would cut into funding for military actions not explicitly authorized by Congress. It would also tighten the definition of hostilities under the War Powers Revolution to cover not just cases of military forces on the ground, but troops deployed, quote, irrespective of the domain, unquote. Hostilities not approved by Congress would be required to end after 20 days rather than the current 60 days. The measure would also sunset 180 days after enactment. All existing authorizations for the use of military force, AUMFs, including the 2001 AUMF passed in the wake of September 11th attacks, and upon which every consecutive administration has leaned to justify military regions and actions around the world. Instead of the current default approval of arms sales, barring a passage of a resolution of disapproval by veto-proof majorities of the House and Senate, the proposal directs Congress to proactively approve certain sales topping $14 million, including those of air to ground weapons. Dr. Enel Shalain, Enel Shalain tweeted, if passed, this bill would make forever wars impossible, and it would require active congressional approval of weapons sales. Currently, they're approved unless Congress votes against them, and with veto-proof majorities. Thanks to at Chris Murphy, Connecticut, at Senator Mike Lee, at Senator Sanders, and many more. Unlikely Senate alliance aims to claw back Congress' foreign policy powers. Senators Chris Murphy, Mike Lee, and Bernie Sanders introduced legislation to give Congress a larger role in U.S. foreign policy. The legislation would further restrain executive national security powers by requiring congressional approval of an emergency declaration within 30 days. Such emergencies won't be allowed to exceed 5 years, with annual congressional renewals needed. The legislation would also limit the range of emergency powers the president would tap. Making the case for the legislation in an op-ed published Thursday at War on the Rocks, Murphy put the proposal in the context of the current moment, quote, when the definition of enemies and the parameters of war are harder to define than ever, unquote, and, quote again, the pace of executive war-making has become dizzying. The National Security Powers Act, he added, would, quote, reset the foreign policy balance between Congress and the executive branch. The restraints on arms sales, he noted, would not apply to U.S. allies, including Israel. He explained, on war making, would not apply to U.S. allies, including Israel. On war making, the bill would require any authorization for the use of force abroad be bound by specific objectives and geographic limits and be reevaluated after 2 years. Congress could renew the authorization, but only by a vote of both chambers. There's a strong case to be made for that war to continue beyond 2 years. The administration should have to make it to the American public, and Congress should vote on the matter. No more endless wars. This bill replaces the current War Powers Act, closing loopholes long used by the president to circumvent Congress, while also forcing members of Congress to stop abdicating its duties and take the tough votes on matters of war and peace. With respect to arms sales, current law only applies to the biggest weapon transfers and requires Congress to pass a resolution of disapproval through both houses in just 30 days. That's too limited and cumbersome. It should come as no surprise that Congress has never successfully stopped an arms sale through this process. But the National Security Powers Act would flip the script and require Congress to take a limited number of affirmative votes before the proposed sales could proceed. And we would not need to vote on every sale, just those that pose the highest risks, as in cases where the administration proposes to sell the most lethal or technologically advanced weapons to countries other than our NATO allies, Israel, and key defense partners in the Asia-Pacific region. I wonder if that includes Saudi, because, of course, big issue, selling arms to the Saudi for use in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia is committing war crimes for sure and implicating the United States in those same war crimes. Sanders, for his part, stressed that the legislation is sorely needed to put a check on runaway militarism. Quote, I believe we've become far too comfortable with the United States engaging in military interventions all over the world. The time is long overdue for Congress to reassert its constitutional role in matters of war and peace. The framers gave that power to declare war to Congress, the branch most accountable to the people. But over many years, Congress has allowed its oversight authority to wane and executive power to expand. Quote, this legislation is an important step toward reasserting that constitutional power, and I hope it will lead to a larger discussion both in the Congress and among the public about the uses of military force in our foreign policy. Representative James McGovern, Democrat of Massachusetts, chairperson of the Rules Committee in the House, by the way, is expected to introduce a House companion measure in the coming weeks. In a statement Tuesday, McGovern expressed hope the measure would put an end to endless wars, re-examine executive powers, and build a more safe and peaceful world, unquote. So, look at this in the context of Peru, Cuba, and what they reveal about the foreign policy of the United States in the rest of this hemisphere. We know the United States is uncomfortable with AMLO as the president of Mexico. We know the United States is uncomfortable with what's going on in Nicaragua as well. We don't like the regime there. We think it's too socialist, it's too lefty, and we have made hostile moves towards that particular regime as well. And they're all the South American regimes, okay, we talked about. So, there are the forever wars which the United States is engaging in. There's this measure, which if it passes into law, would stop the forever wars and prevent us from starting more forever wars in Latin America during this time coming up. So this measure, if it passes, would be extremely important. We should expect the Biden administration to resist the passage of the end of the AUMFs. But he may not do that. We have to see. If he doesn't do it, it will be a very important signal that things are changing in foreign policy. And of course, we have to take note, of that. Now we come to the Assange case. Hey, Shane, how you doing? So, I share this piece with you about the Assange case. Again, from LA Progressive. Assange case again point to Kafkaesque criminalization of journalism. Yes, it is very Kafkaesque. It's like very Catch-22 here. There is Julian Assange with his arm around Sigurdur Ingi Thordarson. Recruited by the United States to build a case against founder and former editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, convicted criminal Sigurdur Ingi Thordarson has admitted to fabricating information used by the Department of Justice in the charges it has filed against the Australian-born publisher. Icelandic news outlet Stundin reported on June 26, 2021, almost a month ago now. As a result, again, attention should be drawn to how absurd the American government's criminalization of Assange is. He is a journalist, once at the helm of a publishing platform, an entity falling under the umbrella of the constitutionally protected press. The Stundin article catalogs Thordarson's lies extensively. According to the Icelandic publication, he falsely maintained that he had received direct instructions from Assange, quote, to engage in computer intrusions in Iceland. At the same time, Thordarson was engaging in, quote, unauthorized communications with members of international hacking groups that he got into contact with via his role as moderator on an open IRC WikiLeaks forum, unquote. The article reads, however, Stundin could not locate evidence of any awareness by WikiLeaks staff of these communications. All the while, he was embezzling massive amounts of money from the anti-secrecy platform. In its criminalization of Assange, the United States continues its non-observance of precedent, such as that set in New York Times Company versus U.S. landmark Supreme Court case that unprecedentedly affirmed protections for the press in cases where publishers release classified information in the public interest. This non-observance is in great part now evidence to have been facilitated by lies that a convicted pedophile and scam artist Thordarson fed the American government. Similarities between the historical developments that precipitated the New York Times Company and what has happened with Assange and members of his circle are remarkable, and they add to any argument that the founder of WikiLeaks is a publisher entitled to the protections of the First Amendment. Against the backdrop of such similarities in Thordarson's conduct during his clandestine employment by the American government, it is again painfully evident that the U.S. will stoop to any depths of legal depravity to accomplish its corrupt goals. Folks, that is something we have to change about our government. I know intelligence and security is a dirty business, but there have to be depths that we will not stoop to in international affairs. There are depths that are antithetical to a democracy like we are supposed to be. I know we are not one now, but part of the reason why we are not one now is that we have been stooping to depths of legal depravity for decades now, and we have been getting blowback from that to domestic politics here, where methods developed and honed for interference in foreign affairs are now being turned back against us. Anyway, parallels between past and present from Daniel Ellsberg to Chelsea Manning. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers to columnist Neil Sheehan in the New York Times. Under remarkably similar circumstances in 2010, Chelsea Manning provided Assange and WikiLeaks with the largest trove of classified documents ever to be published in American history. Both Ellsberg and Manning had spent time in the military. Ellsberg was a company commander and a platoon leader in the Marines from 1954 to 1957. He served in Southeast Asia. Dr. Ellsberg went on to work as a military analyst for the highest levels of the U.S. government. Similarly, Manning was a soldier stationed in Iraq from 2007 to 2010. In their respective military careers, both Dr. Ellsberg and Manning experienced the trauma of two of America's worst military campaigns. Both were ultimately motivated to disrupt these campaigns by leaking classified information to both of the publications. I lost the thread here. To major publications. Both were charged with violating the Espionage Act of 1917. The piece of legislation passed shortly after America entered the First World War, which aimed to stamp out subversion within the military and amongst socialist dissidents, activists, and politicians. At the Act's core was an attempt to mitigate the threat of espionage in wartime. In leaking such a massive trove of classified documents, Manning may have met a less favorable fate than Dr. Ellsberg. She was convicted of violating the act by a military court and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. By contrast, Dr. Ellsberg was acquitted of all charges when it was discovered that entities working for President Nixon had attempted to illegally obtain evidence of his alleged wrongdoing. Those were the burglaries, the Watergate burglaries. Likewise, in releasing these documents, often likened to the Pentagon Papers, by WikiLeaks is reminiscent to the New York Times, when the New York Times released the Pentagon Papers. Provided with the papers in the early 70s by Dr. Ellsberg, journalist Neil Sheehan at the New York Times is like an historical version of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Both men came into possession of classified information. Both men were instrumental in exposing the global community to the leaks, each facilitated during their respective careers. The course of public opinion on the Vietnam War in Sheehan's case and America's involvement in the Middle East case, the Middle East in Assange's case, was radically altered in a positive fashion as a result of Sheehan and Assange. The leaks only bolstered the American public's legitimate opposition to the Vietnam and Iraq wars. American presidents during the Vietnam War promised a swift end to the military campaign. However, they failed to deliver on that. Likewise, American presidents since George W. Bush have either implicitly or explicitly claimed the Middle Eastern campaign would be swift, but America's presence in the Middle East has been anything but swift. In other words, the parallels between the circumstances under which the Southeast Asian campaign and the Middle Eastern campaign have taken place are striking. Manning is the present-day version of Ellsberg. Assange is the present-day version of Sheehan. WikiLeaks is the present-day version of the New York Times. There is a lesson to be learned from observations about these parallels. These lessons bear upon how unobservant the American government can be of the rights to which publishers are entitled under the First Amendment. The pro-press freedom precedent set in New York Times Company versus the United States. For the sake of relieving Assange of the criminal charges he faces for allegedly violating the Espionage Act, one need only prove that WikiLeaks is a publishing platform, that Assange is like an editor-in-chief or a journalist at any news publication. If he is merely a journalist, if he is undeniably like Sheehan, the government has no case. And proving that WikiLeaks and Assange are such entities is not as difficult as one might think. Against the backdrop of New York Times Company versus United States, it is easy to dispel the allegations against Assange. In New York Times Company, justices of the Supreme Court venerated the New York Times for its publication of the Pentagon Papers, asserting that information within the papers was essential to the public interest, asserting that democracy is only possible when the citizenry may engage in political processes in an educated manner. Justice Hugo Black, for example, argued that, quote, the press was meant to serve the governed, not the governors, unquote, in the opinion handed down by the court on June 30th, 1971. Justice Black continued, only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. Paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people and sending them off to distant lands to die of foreign fevers and foreign shot and shell. The framers and Justice Black hailed the press as a check on the powers our three branches of government have. It is this check on power they believe maintained a truly free and democratic state. In keeping the public well informed, the press preserves the public's ability to meaningfully oppose state power. Circa 2010, WikiLeaks was undeniably in a similar situation to the New York Times in the 1970s. The, quote, Afghan war diary, unquote, featured extensive documentation of how brutal the American military has been in the Middle East insofar as it feared such extensive documentation. The similarity between the anti-secrecy platform and the news publication is striking. But is WikiLeaks a, quote, publication, unquote, in the sense that the American judicial system would legally recognize in New York Times Company and United States versus Washington Post Company, a definition of publication was laid out in varying degrees of explicitness. Ultimately, in both cases, the Supreme Court affirmed the sacred nature of publishing activities as conducted by NYT and the Post and their respective releases of the papers. Recognized in each case as entities falling under the umbrella of the constitutionally protected press and allowed to proceed with the publication of the papers. The newspapers were legitimized by the Supreme Court as entities within, quote, the press, unquote, serving the public and disclosing information that Americans needed to consume in order to engage meaningfully in the democratic process. But have WikiLeaks and Assange served the public interest in the way the New York Times and the Post did? As of late, politicians across the political spectrum in America have insisted President Biden drop the charges against the Australian-born journalist, arguing that he is a publisher facilitating democratic processes by disclosing information of public interest, often pointing to New York Times Co. These politicians lend credence to the argument that Assange is no different from any editor in any news publication. If New York Times can ultimately proceed with releasing the papers, and if WikiLeaks is a news publication in terms of how it functions in compliance with legal definitions of the constitutionally protected press, then the government's case for pursuing Assange is absurd. The government is pursuing an entity belonging to the historically protected press. Conclusion. Again, Chelsea Manning is the present version of Dr. Ellsberg, Assange is the present-day version of Sheehan, and WikiLeaks is the present-day version of the New York Times. Again, given these similarities, pursuit of Assange is absurd. Freedom of the press is guaranteed under the First Amendment, but in the United States, historically, overprevalent corruption and overwhelmingly abusive exercise of American exceptionalism, far too many administrations have not observed that right. Although few would like to admit this, former President Obama's administration, for example, prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other administrations combined. Former President Trump was certainly as egregious, and President Biden has continued to criminalize journalism by not terminating the proceedings against Assange. In its non-observance of precedent, the U.S. government not only continues to violate Assange's human rights as Assange rots in an English prison during ongoing extradition proceedings, but it also is assaulting the bases of our government laid out by the Founding Fathers. And in this non-observance, it has relied in large part on fabricated evidence by a convicted pedophile and fraudster, Sigurdur Ingi Thordarson. Has it ever been more apparent that the American legal system is Kafkaesque and not at all symbolized by Lady Justice, the blindfolded and scale-holding so-called emblem of a fair and just legal system? I thought that was a brilliant piece, very, very well taken, very, very well framed. If the charges are going to be dismissed against Julian Assange, they will have to be dismissed on the basis of the case that was laid out in this particular article. Why is this important in terms of the overall thrust of foreign policy? Because what administrations have been doing again and again and again is to persecute the whistleblowers and repress the free press from following stories that are dangerous to the military-industrial complex in the government and into the corruption of that particular complex. Argue this is going to continue to go on, in which case it will be a severe obstruction to solving the foreign policy problems that we currently face. What are those foreign policy problems? The foreign policy problems are the conduct of the foreign policy that I am now about to talk about from the next article that I'll talk about and that I will embellish on because I don't quite agree with the interpretation, but it is close to the truth. It was advanced today in Counterpunch by Melvin Goodman. Holding on to the Cold War is the article, and I've shared it with you. I forgot to share the Assange article with you, but the link is there so you can get it. The United States cannot escape the consequences of the Cold War. It has shaped our culture, our political institutions, our national priorities. The Second World War ended 75 years ago, but we still outspend the entire global community on defense, control, and overseas military infrastructure with more than 700 bases and facilities, and allocate tens of billions of dollars annually to nuclear forces. Now add the absurdity of the Space Command. The Cold War divided Europe, engulfed the Third World, our briar patch, inspired a reckless arms race, and created chronic geopolitical tensions. As a result, the United States has become a national security state, relying on military power and use of force, despite having the most secure geographical boundaries of any major political power. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. The most secure geographical boundaries of any major power. And that includes China. It's easier to invade China than it is to invade the United States. Recent events in Haiti that culminated in the assassination of President Jovenel Moise is one more reminder of our Cold War policy of supporting authoritarian leaders around the world in order to advance U.S. interests. Biden supported Moise despite warnings about his increasingly autocratic rule. U.S. presidents throughout the Cold War emphasized the importance of democratic government and rules-based internationalism. But these bromides were typically observed in the breach. No American president has been willing to tackle the problem of our national security state, although some presidents have done better than others. Presidents Eisenhower and Carter could claim no significant battlefield casualties on their watch. And Presidents Kennedy, Nixon, and Reagan opposed the Pentagon in their pursuit of arms control and disarmament. But no president since Eisenhower has understood the military. Several were intimidated by the military, Clinton and Obama, and others too willing to yield to the military, the senior Bush and the junior Bush. Biden has the advantage of a half century of exposure to our militarization of national security policy. He even warned Obama not to get, quote, boxed in, unquote, by the military, thereby earning the ire of Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who, like too many secretaries, was captured by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But 6 months into his presidency, Biden has not addressed collective and universal solutions to foreign policy. Instead, he trades on Cold War tropes, particularly with regard to Russia and China. Biden's efforts to challenge, lost the thread for a second here, to challenge both Russia and China is particularly counterproductive in view of the close Sino-Russian relationship that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have forged. They've ended a 60-year period of discontinuity, actually, of conflict, that included struggles over aid to North Vietnam, warfare on their border, and differences over military aid and geopolitical rivalries. Biden's diplomatic foray into Europe in June and his summitry with Germany's Angela Merkel in July produced ample evidence of the kind of, quote, old thinking, unquote, that has dominated U.S. policy and diplomacy even after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which created an opportunity for new thinking, quote unquote. Biden's European thrust revolves around the relaunching of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, including expanding its scope to deal with the challenge from China. God, what sense does that make? Biden's national security team believes the United States can isolate and contain China. For the first time, a NATO document included China in the list of security threats for the alliance, which probably produced a good deal of head-scratching in Beijing. The key European states signed on reluctantly. They prefer not to be part of the Sino-American differences that were worsened by the Trump administration. Meanwhile, Russian President Putin may be taking satisfaction from NATO's firm stance against China, which was designed in part to compensate for the lack of a firm stance against Russia. Germany's defense of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and Franco-German interest in coordinating policy with Russia point to the absence of any lasting success for Biden's diplomacy in Europe. German Chancellor Merkel clearly and succinctly said with regard to U.S. and European approaches to the problems of Russia and Ukraine that, quote, we've come to different assessments. Angela Merkel made no specific response to Biden's interest in countering China. France and Italy appear to be aligned with Germany on these key bilateral issues. Similarly, many Asian nations don't want to choose between the United States for reasons of security versus China for reasons of their own prosperity. Instead of reversing the decoupling policies of the Trump administration toward China, Biden has appointed a national security team, wink and blink and a nod, that is committed to more aggressively countering and containing China and East Asia. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan are China hardliners. Sullivan's deputy is Kurt Campbell, who developed the policy of a pivot, quote unquote, toward China 10 years ago. Campbell's senior aide in the National Security Council is Rush Doshi, who recently published, quote, The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order, unquote. What American order? There's no American order. There's American ordering all over the globe. But I don't see too much order. I see unstable hegemony that will soon be challenged all over the world, beyond our capacity to do anything about. Sullivan has placed another hardliner. This is me saying that. Go on with the article. Sullivan has placed another hardliner, Eli Ratner, as a special advisor to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. These appointments suggest the problem of classic groupthink on China, our greatest diplomatic challenge, relying on the Cold War principle of negotiating from a position of strength. Yeah, they're really neurotic about that, aren't they? Strength in weapons, strength in military, not economic strength. Our economic strength has been going away now. Continuously, it's been going away. What about negotiating from a position of economic strength? What they in the economic area, they negotiate from a position of dollar strength. They try to choke other nations by denying them dollars in various ways and denying them trade, in various ways. But that's not a lasting basis for negotiating from a position of strength. You also have to have a strong economy, and increasingly the United States is having a shitty economy. Meanwhile, the U.S. military-industrial congressional community is taking advantage of Sino-American differences over the South China Sea and U.S.-Russia tensions over Ukraine to campaign for greater defense spending. The defense community particularly is fixated on the issue of China as a major threat and appears to have no understanding of possible constraints on policy toward China. At the same time, there is a bipartisan consensus in Congress that China constitutes the central threat to the United States. The U.S. Innovation and Competition Act attracted a bipartisan majority by emphasizing the importance of challenging China in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. I have only one thing to say about that. Why should we be challenging China in that area? Why shouldn't they be challenging us? Why is it that China's ahead in artificial intelligence and quantum computing? What have we been doing all these years when it comes to artificial intelligence and quantum computing? I know we've been doing something, but we've been allowing our companies to go over there and introduce what we know in this area into China itself, helping them to compete with us in the areas of artificial intelligence and quantum computing. And we have really little deliberate industrial policy in our own in this area, leaving it to the goddamn private companies who have been creating monopolies. The often hyperbolic charges in the Congress and the mainstream media against China have led to xenophobic rhetoric against Asian Americans, according to the leaders of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. The Biden administration believes that the development of state-of-the-art weaponry will discourage China from more aggressive moves towards Taiwan and in the South China Sea. U.S. actions in the South China Sea revolve around I lost the thread again. Quasi-Cold War measures that include deployment of aircraft carriers and freedom of navigation operations. U.S. actions vis-a-vis Ukraine are aimed at creating a strategic relationship with Kiev and challenging the Russian sphere of influence in the Black Sea. So notice this. We're challenging the Russian sphere of influence in the Black Sea, which is right close to Russia. And we're challenging the sphere of influence of China in the South China Sea, right close to China. And we expect to be able to do both of those things forever, while the Chinese get continuously strong in relation to the capacities of their economy. Folks, this is not going to happen. We have to look to our own internal economic strength and develop that. The Biden administration, I'm talking about internal economic strength. I'm talking about leadership in those areas which are essential to the survival of the human race. Don't even like the term human race. Humanity. The Biden administration is wrongly trying to present Russia and China as existential threats to Western democracy. Too many pundits and mainstream media describe Iran and North Korea similarly. These countries are problems for U.S. diplomacy, but the existential problems for the United States are a world with too many nuclear powers, a pandemic, a climate crisis, and cybersecurity, not to mention the national security state. These are the existential problems for our democracy. As we've already seen, our democracy is being severely undermined by neoliberalism, by the very ideology that has been governing U.S. policy, both domestically and in foreign policy, where it manifests as imperialism and domination of other nations. These problems demand a collective and cooperative approach, says Goodman. And the United States is best placed to lead the way in making Russia and China stakeholders on these issues. Unfortunately, Biden and his national security team don't appear to be willing or even witting. Now, this national security team, this may be Biden's biggest failure in his administration so far, even bigger than domestically, because they are the wrong people for this job. What is this job? Not too long ago, well, I guess it was now about 5 years back, time flies when you're having fun. One of the books I wrote during that period was Who Needs Balanced Trade? Who Needs a Balanced Budget? In spite of a recommendation from Stephanie Kelton, that book has been read by relatively few people. One of the things it did, which to my mind was something of a revolution in paradigm, is that it approached things both in the area of the balanced budget and balanced trade from the viewpoint of the idea of the public purpose, which is an idea frequently referred to when discussing fiscal policy from an MMT point of view. I will stop sharing this now, and you will see me full blown. What I did in that book was to present the idea of the public purpose in some detail, and then propose that in the areas of domestic and fiscal policy, we should be governed by the idea of public purpose, and that in the area of foreign policy and foreign trade, but not just foreign trade, foreign policy generally, we had to be governed by the same idea. And not only that, that what we had to do was to look to integrate both our foreign policy and our domestic policies from the viewpoint of public purpose, from an overarching point of view of public purpose, so that our foreign policy and our domestic policy would not work against each other, so that they would be working hand in glove, for the good of the citizens of the United States according to the conception of public purpose held by those particular citizens. That means that in the area of foreign policy, we should be working for public purpose also. Do we think that the imperialist foreign policy being followed by the United States, the continuous hostility to the emergence of socialist governments and socialist countries all around the world, especially in Latin America, but even in the Middle East, even in the Far East, when we see the emergence of governments like this, we instinctively say, oh no, we've got to have regime change in those governments. Now, those kinds of regimes and those kinds of governments are going to be increasingly coming to the Middle East too. Not just to Latin America. They'll be increasingly coming to Africa too. Will we continue with this knee-jerk reaction to try to oppose those governments and reinstall tyrannical governments in their place? Do we have enough in the way of resources and real wealth and riches to control the whole world in this way, to make all the regimes the way we would like to see them, cast in the neoliberal image of the United States? Do we have the real capability to do this? Or is this just a fever dream of our own? I think it's the latter. I think it is a fever dream. It is an impossibility. It is not something that can be done, and it is not in line with the public purpose of the United States either. It is not about the public purpose of the United States. It is about these various interests in the United States getting richer over a period of time. They're enmeshed in this national security state. They live by it. Their families live by it. They benefit from it. They don't unconsciously ever want to see it change. They don't care about the damage it causes around the world and to other Americans. They just want to perpetuate it as a regime inside of the United States. That's what they have done. And the way they carry out foreign policy is designed to reinforce that particular regime at home and prevent challenges to it. But the key existential question is, can they continue to follow these policies both at home and abroad in such a way that the real public purposes of the United States, purposes like getting back to democracy again, purposes like making possible our very survival in the face of the existential crisis of the climate emergency, getting health care as a human right for people, gaining social safety nets which allows Americans to live in dignity, gaining a fair and just criminal justice system at long last, where people are not killed because of their status, not killed because of their color, not killed because of their ethnic identification. When we seek that kind of system in accord with the public purpose of the American people, can we afford the kind of regime that I've been describing here? I think the answer is no, we cannot. That foreign policy, which reinforces the neoliberal regime domestically, has to go. And it has to go in the direction of a cooperative foreign policy trying to maximize the mutual interest of all the major nations of the world and all the peoples of the world. It has to be one that accommodates the aspirations of all. That is what is in accord with the public purposes of the United States. And what does that mean? That means get out of these bases all over the world. That means don't be sending the CIA into various Latin American countries to try to shape things. Let the people of these countries make their own decisions. Pay attention to what is going on at home. Build for America. Biden says build back better. Build back better ought to mean build back for the public purpose of the United States. And that also has to mean change our foreign policies so the foreign policies are also in accordance with the public purposes of the United States. That has to include fair trade relations with other nations, but not simply fair trade relations, but in the large trade relations that are in accord with the public purposes of the people of the United States. That's what I wrote about, in my book. I didn't draw all the conclusions that I've drawn here, but I pointed out that it shouldn't be about balanced trade. It shouldn't be about any kind of managed trade. It shouldn't be about laissez-faire trade. It shouldn't even be about simply fair trade if it's just about fair trade. It has to be about trade which is in accord with the public purposes of the United States, in accord with the benefits that our people want to have a good life here, which our people have to understand must be consistent with other people in the world having a good life where they are as well. So it's going to take cooperative and mutually collaborative relations with other nations of the world for a long time, with the emerging nations of the world. I started out these 2 days of programming by pointing to the Chinese transformation. Well, let me tell you in closing, we need that kind of transformation here, not because we're falling behind the Chinese. Yes, we are that, but that's not what's important. We're falling behind our own aspirations about what kind of country we want to have, including the political aspects of that country, with a democracy that percolates from the bottom up, and with a free press, and with whistleblowers protected, and with a vigorous public holding its leaders accountable all the time. We don't have that now. We've got to have that. That's the only way we're going to get through the just transition to a Green New Deal. It's the only way we're going to get through the climate emergency in the brief time we need to get through it for us and other nations all together to survive. So that's my message for tonight. I'm sorry there were so few of you here to hear it, but I will now entertain your comments. Thanks to everybody who has chosen to stay on. Ghostart said, Twitter just locked out Syrian girl for pointing out there's proof of Israel's crimes against Pakistan. However, there's none for China's Uyghur accusations. Who is Syrian Girl? Is that the Twitter handle, okay, of Rania Khalek by any chance? Or is it somebody else? Kay says, Biden not doing too bad with his town hall tonight. Steve said, I looked for it, but I couldn't find it. On CNN, Steve, still on now. You mean I've been competing with the President of the United States? Oh, well. And Evelina says, Vargas Llosa, great Peruvian author, a progressive turned reactionary, an imagination run wild, a madman of sorts, trying to pass on fiction as reality. Kay says, town hall is now over. Well, I wasn't competing with him for long because he was over by 9:21. Evelyn says, he lives in Spain now, but gets around. Another operator affected by the extreme right wing. Dostart says, Biden's off his meds, off his rocker, off the wall. Shane at KRD Media says, hey, Joe. Evelyn says, Fujimori is Japanese, for crying out loud. Yeah, I know. I know. Alberto Fujimori was Japanese too. But Keiko Fujimori is actually half Japanese and half Latin, isn't she? Since her mother, Susanna, was probably not Japanese, right? Kay says, election fraud sounds all too familiar. Steve says, at least their election seemed to be legitimate, but Castillo better watch his back. You probably saw the work Fiorella did down on the election. I did see that. Yeah, of course he's got to watch his back. He's been watching his back since the election. I'm very surprised it's gotten this far, to the point of his getting installed within a week. Let's keep our fingers crossed that happens. Not to say that any Peruvian indigenous will do, but let's give Castillo a chance. Evo support him. Evo supports him, okay? Or Evo, or are you calling on Evo to support him? Evelina. Wolfbrand says, definitely. Evelina says, Evo supports him. Gosta says, I think Joe Biden won malarkey, had too much ice cream before taking the stage. Hashtag brain freeze. And Evelyn says, Chile and Cuba also have copper. And Evelyn says, hashtag SOS Colombia. Colombia with an O. Oops. Yeah, Colombia does have an O. It is Colombia. Steve says, didn't they find huge deposits of lithium or something like it in Peru recently? Evelina, lithium triangle. Chile, Bolivia, Argentina in the northwest. Yes. Now, Peru is lithium also. Anywhere in the Andes, you can find it. Gostad says, Coop Kachu. Kay says, thank you for your info, Evelina. Adds to the story. Evelina says, Argentina is the third way espoused by Perón since the 30s. It's strong on industrial development with social justice. Just call it the pink wave. Yes, I think it's been stronger in the area of social justice more recently than it was in the Peronista days, isn't it? Evelina says, Steve says, Evelina should be a guest on the show. Hey, Evelina, that's a great idea. You want to be a guest on the show and have a conversation? That would be great. Kay says, yes, she should, Steve Wolfbrand. Steve Wolfbrand, I'm not at all rigorous, just a little informed. Evelina says, laugh out, Kay. But laugh out loud, Kay. Kay says, Evelina Pont, you are very informed. Stephen said, Biden just bombed Somalia, for crying out loud. I know! What was that about? He bombed Somalia. What good is bombing Somalia going to do? Why did he give that order? Kay says, good bill, but that will pass, sadly. Evelina says again. He says, in the area of South America, she certainly is. Steve says, or I should say, Biden's handlers bombed Somalia. Ghostar says, Prime Minister Karimi, no need for U.S. combat forces in Iraq. Good for him. Evelina says, hope the measure passes, but I fear much of Congress would rather the president take the blame for something they are largely okay with. Evelina says, with the real important exception of a few real patriots, Evelina says, all the power to them. Kay says, sadly, we have very few real patriots. Kay says, I'm running out of gas quickly. Laugh out loud. I actually was able to get out for 2 walks today. Laugh out loud. Steve says, and then there's Seth Rich. Seth Rich again. Evelina says, good for you, Kay. Kay says, who is he, Steve Wolfbrand? To think the Guardian invited Assange to London in the first place and benefited from publishing his material. Amazing. Steve says he worked for the DNC and was murdered, probably for leaking Hillary information to WikiLeaks. Steve Wolfman said yes, and meanwhile, the actual war criminals walk free. They're all walking free. Carmen says, read a couple of headlines at Arizona voters are highly pissed at Sinema and want her out, just like you said, Joe. Well, maybe when she sees the polls, she'll wise up and get with the program. I hope so. Evelina says, Steve Wolfbrand goes to show Assange is just being punished for publishing information, not doing the actual leaking. Absolutely. Weak argument to say he shouldn't have published it? Oh, no, why not? Who said he shouldn't have published it? Of course he should have published it. He did us a tremendous service by publishing it. Lauderdale called him Stinkin' Blinken, but Winkin' Blinken works too. So we could call him Stinkin' Blinken in our more uncivil moments and Winkin' Blinken in our more civil moments. Carmen said, I was just wondering what the COVID vaccine rate is in Peru. It's very, very, very bad. COVID has, Peru has by far the highest fatality per million rate in the world. Okay, at this point, it must be close to 6,000 fatalities per million. Compared to the U.S., I think we're about 1870 or so. I think my feed just was blinking a moment ago. I don't know what happened. Evelina says, as far as I'm concerned, Assange is a hero. Me too. Me too. I thought he was a hero since they started persecuting him. I thought he was a hero before then, but Evelina says there are others. Kay says the U.S. is a complete failure in so many ways. Shake my head. Yeah, Richard Gephardt, I used to enjoy calling things a miserable failure. Well, I think now he has to call the United States a miserable failure. Steve Wolfprint says climate change is happening much faster than anyone thought. I know. Kay says we've known climate change was coming since the 1970s. We knew it was happening since the 1970s. We did nothing except keep on polluting. Yeah, we did. That was the real tragedy of the defeat of Jimmy Carter by Ronald Reagan, okay, in 1980, because Carter was putting us on the right path with respect to the climate emergency and with respect to shifting to clean power. And he would have continued that, and we would have had a much better transition. And we probably would have had another Democratic president after him had he not been defeated by Reagan. And you know something? That defeat was avoidable, totally avoidable. Number one thing to do don't replace the head of the Fed with Paul Volcker. Number two thing to do, come to agreement with Teddy Kennedy, okay, and with Robert Byrd, and pass a Medicare for All bill through Congress. They had the big majorities necessary to do that. Had they done those two things, and also had tight wage and price controls through that particular period, they would have won the election, okay, of 1980. And they could have gone on with the key transition that we needed. Kay says, I remember when the Cuyahoga River was on fire here in Ohio when I was young. Yes, and I remember when the Buffalo, whatever it was up in Buffalo, was on fire as well. Elizabeth Warren is here at 10:44, and she's putting in a raft of tweets from 10:44, and here, Kay, is Lena, public purpose and foreign policy, as in domestic policy, not only speaks of excellence, it's the only way forward. Thank you, Evelina. I am still the acting director of the Center for the Public Purpose, which is an Oregon nonprofit. Unfortunately, I've had not much time to devote to the nonprofit. I need some people to help me because I've got to continue these streams as well. And there's more Elizabeth Warren at 10:45. I'm not going to read that because, and there's chaos. I'm joined by chaos. I will not read any of their comments because they're not really part of our discussion here. They come to disrupt. They do not come to add anything to our discussion. So, I am just about finished now. Unless you have some other comments, I am going to say goodnight. I am trying, hang on a second, I'm going to check on one thing here. I'll check to see if I have a message which will concern what I'm doing on Saturday. A coming attraction for Saturday. I have an email message. Okay, so actions. Well, first of all, I did want to say something about the March for Medicare for All. And then I'll say a little something about coming attractions. As many of you know by now, and if you don't know by now, you should know that there is a march in something like 52 cities across the United States. It's a march, okay, for Medicare for All. There's a march here in D.C. at Lincoln Park. The times for the march will be from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Not all of that time will be spent, okay, in marching. The schedule is people meet at Lincoln Park, okay, at 11 a.m. That's east of the Capitol Complex in Washington, D.C. It's a little bit east of the Library of Congress. Their opening speeches at 11:45 a.m. They last until about 12:30 or so. There's no program that I see yet on the page for who's giving the probably Savage Joy Marie will be giving the opening speeches, one of the opening speeches, since she is the MC. I would expect her to be giving one of the opening speeches. Outside of that, I don't know who's giving the opening speeches, but there is about an hour of opening speeches between 11:45 a.m. and 12:30 p.m. when the march starts. I assume the march will be to the Capitol, okay, and back. Uh, People will be returning to Lincoln Park for speeches, for a vigil, and live entertainment. The speakers that I have listed thus far, this is not uh, complete. I'm sure there have been changes because changes have been going on all this week. And this is just for the DC program. There are other big things going on, like in Los Angeles. There's going to be a big event. There's a big event in New York. There's going to be an event, okay, in Detroit, Chicago. It's lots and lots of big cities across the country. But in Washington, D.C., the keynote speaker will be Marianne Williamson. The Reverend Annie Chambers will be speaking. Paula Jean Swearingen of West Virginia will be speaking. Lee Camp will be speaking. Dr. Margaret Flowers, one of the leading authorities on Medicare for All for years now, since at least 2009, will be speaking. Dr. Joe Jarvis will be speaking. Dr. Valerie McCrae Scott, I'm sorry, Dr. Valerie McCrae will be speaking. Scott Patez-Noyers of Hull, Washington, and the Red Berets will be speaking. Laura Fielding, the executive director of the Red Berets, will be speaking. Also, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Okay, I think it's Afeni, AFENI. He or she will be speaking. I think that he also has a connection to the Red Berets and whole Washington as well, but don't quote me on that. I'm not sure about that. Also, Jeff Ginter, our good friend, Jeff Ginter, okay, of MMT fame and Medicare for All fame, will be speaking. And I can guarantee that is going to be a barn burner. And Cheryl Van Epps will be speaking, and Joe Nice will be speaking as well. So that is quite a program. That is going to go on from 2 p.m. Until the speeches are over. Then there's going to be a vigil, okay, and live entertainment. I suspect, they don't say here, but I suspect the speeches and the emceeing by Savage Joy will go on between 2 and 4, and then there'll probably be a vigil and live entertainment from 4 to 5. Okay. There's very good transportation there. Okay, it is a bit of a walk from the various sources, okay, of transportation, but there is parking around there, and but there's a metro station, Eastern Market, off the Blue, Orange, and Silver lines. There are walks from the sources of mass transportation to the park, ranging from 10 minutes to 13 minutes by foot. So the transportation is good. The park is good. There are accessible restrooms, also dedicated seating. Note from the organizer, the park has accessible viewing areas, and there will be an ADA porta potty on site. Have accessibility questions, reply to your registration email to confirm your requirements or request more information. So I wanted to give you a heads up, okay, on that. Then, Okay, I want to say that while I'll be on tomorrow night with a good show, uh, on Saturday, I'll be coming on again with Howie Hawkins. And the reason why I'm having him back is to discuss in much more detail his New Deal program, because I don't believe it's gotten anywhere near the discussion that it actually deserves. And so we are going to do that here. Okay, I just got a note from him, okay, a few minutes ago, saying that he's accepted, okay, an invitation to come back again, okay, on Saturday. So, okay, I meant to tell you that, and now it's time to say goodnight, but I will read out a bunch of other news here before I go. Kay says, thank you all for a great discussion. I love these and all of you too. Thank you, Kay. We love you too. Doris Pierce says, thank you and good night all. Gustad says, you know, Dasher and Dancer and Prancer and Vixen, Comet and Cupid, and Obama and Blinken. But do you recall the most famous reindeer of all? Gustad says, Adolf the Red Scare Reindeer. Steve says, I'll probably be marching here, okay, in LA. Okay, I doubt I'll be marching here because the heat of the day here, given my advanced age, it's probably unwise for me to be marching. But, okay, I am intending at this point, if it's not a totally scorching day, to travel down to hear the speeches and to give some moral support, okay, to the group. Okay, I really should, because I know personally 4 people on the program. I don't know, I have to count again. It might be 5, okay, by now. So I think I really ought to go and hear him speak. Evelina says, Dr. Joe, working for the public purpose is probably the most important thing we can do. Can you elaborate on what you're doing in Oregon? Well, we're not actually doing anything out in Oregon. It's incorporated as a nonprofit out there, and it has been for a couple of years, but it's not really constituted. I mean, the work that has been going on, the little work that's been done, the people who formed it quickly dispersed and are doing other things now. Okay, I'm really the only one that's there to do any work on it. And what I've been doing over a period of years is formulating the idea of the public purpose in more and more detail as a centerpiece for basically integrating the MMT lens with other lenses in other part of the social sciences, so that we can work towards having integrative federal policy across a number of disciplines, okay, including economics. So yes, it probably is the most important thing that we can do, but okay, in order to do that, I need far more financial support and far more help, okay, from people. And really, I don't want to be running the place. Okay, it's not something. In other words, to run this place, one has to be able to work 60 to 70 hours a week. I did that for most of my life, but I don't intend to do that anymore. I mean, I certainly work a solid, uh, certainly work a solid week now. Okay? I mean, I do that, but I don't intend to do the kind of work that you have to do to head up, okay, an organization like that. I am the acting director of the organization. Technically, I'm the acting president of the Center for the Public Purpose. But I really need someone to give the presidency to who's willing to put in that kind of work. And my role would then be a role of something like a senior theoretician, senior advisor, okay, and live streamer. That's the kind of role that I was looking for. I was cast in the role, okay, as acting president because there was no one else to do it. Okay, the others, okay, are inactive. I'm basically holding the organization, such as it is, together myself. Okay, I need volunteers for the organization. I need people who are willing to put in work. I'm certainly willing to direct people in that kind of endeavor. Okay, and I can do that well, but the hours that I have to devote to it at this age, okay, are limited. Steve Wolfbrand says, Bernie is coming to Ohio to campaign with Nina. Cool. Yeah, that's cool. But both Bernie and Nina should get their butts to a Medicare for All march. What's been happening, Kay, is bad. There are these mass movements starting. In part, they're based on social media. They're organized out of social media. But they're not even primarily about social media. They organize people in social media to make a presence in the public sphere, as is being done with this march for Medicare for All. Now, I have no idea why the politicians and the interest groups working on Medicare for All will not support this particular march. The Hollywood activists have been they're endorsing the march, and they're coming to speak. Okay, and people you would normally identify as the social media activists are coming to speak and are coming to support these marches. But the national politicians who ran on Medicare for All and who were elected based on their support for Medicare for All have not been endorsing this march and supporting this march. And it is scandalous that they have not been doing that. They have opened up a gap between the grassroots and themselves. That gap has to heal, and everybody has to come together. And they won't do it because they have been preoccupied with compromising on Medicare for All and working with Biden to get what they can get towards Medicare for All. Now, I'm not trying to condemn that per se, because I do think that if you can bargain to get things on the road to Medicare for All, like lowering the age from 65 to 60, at the same time, you expand the coverage to basically cover everything. That is something concrete. It's a concrete accomplishment. It's not like the public option, which even if it passed, would have been off to the side somewhere, or the original ACA, which did very little for people, but very much for the companies. That wasn't on the track to Medicare for All. To give Bernie credit, what he's doing now with Jay Powell is working on a path to Medicare for All. But the mass movement outside, the outside game, is about working for Medicare for all. And if you want to run on Medicare for all, you can't be part of the inside game but not be part of the outside game. You have to do both. You have to stand up for your outside allies, and you have to support them when they have something going. And by the way, why didn't Jayapal and her hundreds of interest groups have something going for the anniversary of Medicare, July 24th this year, by themselves anyway? Why did it fall to the outside activists? Why did it fall to them to organize this campaign for all of us? All kudos to them. All kudos to the various groups from all over the country, spawned by social media, coming together to put this march together in 52 cities. That is wonderful. But why wasn't there coordination coming from Jayapal and her hundreds of interest groups? The only person active in the interest groups who's supporting this that I have seen thus far is Margaret Flowers. I mean, I don't see anybody else from PNHP as part of this. I don't see people from the NNU. Where are the NNU people? Why aren't they there? How about Sunrise Movement people? Why aren't they there? Why aren't the hundreds of groups that claim to support Medicare for all in support of these marches all over the country? It's a scandal that they're not supporting these marches. Why don't they want to do that? I think it's because they don't want to present that kind of pressure on Joe Biden, who has flatly said if Medicare for all crosses his desk, then he's going to veto it. They don't want to put him on the spot because they're getting the reconciliation bill out of him, which is going to have an awful lot of goodies in it that we all need. So they want to work in a collaborative and cooperative way with him. And so for the moment, they're giving up their longer-term goal, okay, of Medicare for all. They're not putting pressure in the here and now for Medicare for all, for fear that will disturb the concessions they think they're getting from Biden in connection with the reconciliation bill. So that's what's happening. I don't think it's wise to do that. Steve says, I think Lee Camp is speaking in D.C. Steve Wolfman asks, is Bernie going to march? Not that I know. I have not heard that he's going to march. Let me get to where. Bernie is coming to Ohio to campaign with Nina. Cool. Steve says, I think that Lee Camp is speaking in D.C. Steve Wolfbrandt says, among many others. Lana says, stupid question. Is this hashtag the regular Medicare for all, just the state-to-state programs? No, it is not the state-to-state programs. This is for National Improved Medicare for All, for NEMA. This is what it's for. I don't even think that Laura Fielding is going to talk about the state-to-state effort, because this was always conceived from the beginning as being in support of National Improved Medicare for All. Okay, so I don't think it's a stupid question, Lana. I think it's a fine question, but that's the answer as I understand it from Laura at this moment. Evelina says it's going to be immense. I hope so. Ghostart says ST2 Street. I'm not sure what that means. Steve says Jimmy Dore will speak in LA. I know he plans to do that. KRTD Media asks, are you going to tell them about Saturday? I thought I just did, Shane. Steve Wolfbrand says, I wonder, if MSM will mention it. We don't know at this point. Probably depends on how large it is. Evelina says, Savage Joy is a real trooper. I like her. So do I. We used to work together some. Didn't always agree, but we worked together some. And we're friendly at Real Progressives when she was with them, and I was with them too. Steve Wolfbrand says, props to Savage Joy. Indeed, props to Savage Joy. She's done a great job in helping to organize this. She was one of the co-organizers. Ghostart says, Ginter is fire. Jeff Ginter is fire. Very articulate, very, very good speaker. And Dolores Pierce waves and waves. And Janice said, she waves. Okay, Lana says, gee, Jeff is fab. And Dolores says, yay. Oh, she's clapping. Yay. Lana says, love Howie. Please make that announcement early. Okay. And Evelina says, she gives a thumbs up and another icon I can't see. Lana says, haha, Steve. And Lana says, I haven't heard anything about the M4A march, okay, in Minneapolis. Okay, I think there is one, Lana. I'll send you a message after we get off and send you a link to details if I have details. Lana says, I would love to do it if I didn't work full time. Well, it might be possible to go over there to hear some speeches, Lana. Steve Wolfbrand says it's good to get out and meet a local activist in person. Steve says the squad should be marching. Evelina says it's so vital, can't believe there's no one to get the Center for Public Purpose going. Ghostart says, love Susan Sarandon. Yeah, Susan Sarandon is going to be giving the keynote in New York. Steve Wolfbrand asks, is Bernie going to the march? I don't think so. Evelina says they're no longer grassroots. Yeah, they're only grassroots when it comes to election time. Then they want the grassroots. Guess what? If they keep acting like this when it comes to election time, they're not going to have the grassroots. At one time, when Elliot Engel was elected, he had the grassroots too. One day, long, long ago in the past, Joe Crowley was popular too. If you want to use the grassroots, you have to water them continuously so they keep growing. Steve says Savage Joy had a huge part in this on a national level. Yes, she did. So did Sharif Snuggs. There was no central organizer. Evelina says, what can be more pressing domestically right now than NEMA? It's NIMA, by the way, National Improved Medicare for All. Well, the only thing that can be more pressing is doing serious work about the climate. But I don't think that's more pressing. I think the most pressing thing. We are still in the middle of the pandemic. The most pressing thing is Medicare for all. It's been pressing for years and years and years. The damn neoliberals won't do it. They just let people die. They just let people die. For people 50 and above, no, I meant help you with CPP needed work. Oh, did I? Oh, you were referring to that, to Center for Public Purpose needed work. Says, I would love to do it if I didn't work full time. Oh, okay. Thank you, Lana. I appreciate it. There's a website that lists all the marches, I know. In fact, I have that website, and I'm going to send Lana a message with the link, to the Minneapolis March, if there is one. I believe there is. Steve says, too bad AOC could have brought out thousands in New York City to the march, but no, she could have. Evelyn says, continue ordering the grassroots. Brilliant. Well, this is supposed to be a not me, us movement. That's what Bernie created. That movement isn't really going away. It's a shame that Bernie is no longer leading it. Lana says, thanks. Steve says, good night all. Good night all. Indeed, good night all. I'm ending the broadcast. See you tomorrow night, and see you Saturday with Howie at the usual time.